Yesterday, we learned a little bit about a woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's nickname as a child was Minty. She was an enslaved person working on a plantation in Maryland. Her mother and father were also enslaved, living and working on different plantations. Her sisters had been sent to plantations in Georgia, and the owner of the plantation on which she worked tried to send her brother to another plantation, but Minty's mother stopped him from doing so. Remember, to be enslaved means that you are not free to make decisions about your own life, and you do not get paid for the hard work that you do. Many enslaved people in the United States came from Africa. Even though it was very hard to be an enslaved person in the United States, enslaved people did some things that made their lives less harsh. They were a community of support for one another, helping to take care of each other's children on the plantation. They supported each other by looking out for each other and working together. Remember, slavery was allowed in some states in the United States, but not in others. Today, we are going to learn about something called the Underground Railroad. The word underground is sometimes used to describe something that is hidden or secret. The Underground Railroad was not a real railroad that locomotives and trains drove on, but like a real railroad, it helped get people or passengers from one place to another. Passengers on the Underground Railroad were trying to get out of the South, where slavery was legal, and into the North, where slavery was not allowed and they could be free. Passengers usually traveled at night and moved through the woods so that they would not be seen, because they wanted to keep their movements a secret from plantation owners and slave catchers that were sent to recapture them and bring them back to the plantations they worked on. People traveling on the Underground Railroad also stopped at stations for rest. A conductor on the Underground Railroad was a leader that helped others along on their journey. Today we are going to continue learning about Harriet Tubman and the role that she played on the Underground Railroad. In the last story that we read about Harriet Tubman, something happened that gave her hope that she could fight back. The thing that happened was that she saw her mother fight back against the plantation owner when he wanted to send her brother to a different plantation. Do you think that she will continue to choose to fight back and try to win her freedom? Think on that for a minute, and we will start with our vocabulary words. Rebellious. Someone who is rebellious wants to do things his or her own way and not be controlled by someone else. Sometimes being rebellious is a good thing. An example of good rebellious behavior was when the colonists rebelled against Great Britain and started the Revolutionary War so that they could have freedom. But sometimes being rebellious isn't so good. An example of rebellious behavior that might not be so great is if you are being rebellious by breaking rules that your parents or teachers have in place that keep you safe. See if you can think of some examples of rebellious behavior that you have seen or that you have participated in. Conductor. A conductor is a person who led or directed enslaved Africans to freedom during the Civil War using the Underground Railroad. Today we are going to learn about Harriet Tubman, who was a famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Passengers. Passengers were enslaved Africans who traveled to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Contributions. Contributions are money, materials, information, or work given by someone to help others. Gourd. A gourd is a plant with a hard-shelled fruit that is sometimes dried and hollowed out to be used as a tool. The summer air was hot and heavy. There was no breeze to cut the heat, and the shade of scraggly bushes did little to block the blazing sun. Gnats, mosquitoes, and flies swarmed all around, buzzing and biting. Despite the heat and bugs, the runaway slaves, filthy from head to toe, their clothes tattered and shredded by thorns and branches, their bare feet blistered and cut, slept hard, huddled together in the tall grass. As they slept, a woman, a conductor, watched and guarded over them. Remember, a conductor is someone who leads people on the Underground Railroad. Even now, as they slept deeply in the bushes, this woman sat upright and alert, her sharp eyes scanning the forest and her ears listening for signs of danger. She knew the dangers all too well. Slave catchers were always searching for runaway slaves, lurking in the middle of swamps, hunting for runaways miles away from the nearest house, town, or road, hoping to catch groups of runaway slaves. The slave catchers were paid great sums of money if they caught runaway slaves, and this woman knew very well that the slave catchers would never give up. This woman who stood guard over everyone else was Minty, the same Minty who used to sit by the crib, hoping the plantation owner's baby would not cry. But people did not call her Minty anymore. People now called her Harriet Tubman. When she grew up, Harriet Tubman did not serve in the big house. Remember, the big house was where the plantation owners lived. Perhaps this was because the plantation owners sensed that she was a bit rebellious. She always did things her way. So, from the time she was a young woman, she was sent to work in the fields, plowing and digging, cutting hay and tobacco, and chopping wood. In time, she became as strong and tough as a person could be. When the plantation owner died, Harriet Tubman faced a new danger. It was likely that she would be sent off to Georgia, just like her sisters. Georgia was in the deep South, where many of the plantations grew cotton, and conditions were even worse for enslaved Africans. Work on the cotton plantations was difficult, and it was performed in all types of weather. They plowed the fields with teams of mules, hoed the soil to get rid of weeds, and harvested the cotton by hand. The cotton had to be picked clean and then made into heavy bales that could be transported away from the plantation and sold. Harriet knew she had to run away from her life in slavery. In order to reach freedom, Harriet Tubman needed to use the Underground Railroad. Remember, this was not a real railroad. It was a system of secret routes and hiding places to help enslaved people escape from slavery in the South to reach freedom in the North. If there had been a real railroad to freedom, then escaping would have been easy for Harriet Tubman and other slaves. They could have hopped aboard any train and ridden away from the punishments, endless work, and sorrows of a harsh life. In certain ways, the Underground Railroad was like a real railroad. Does it look like one? Are there any train tracks? Is anything actually underground in that picture? On a real train, there are passengers, or people who travel from one place to another. Runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad were also known as passengers, and as soon as they ran away from the plantation, they set off on an incredible and difficult journey to freedom. But runaways could not complete this journey without help from a conductor. On a real railroad, a conductor is in charge of the train. On the Underground Railroad, a conductor guided runaway slaves, leading them through secret paths and taking them to safe houses. These safe houses were known as stations, and like real train stations, they were places where passengers could rest before moving on to the next part of their journey. Many different people provided these stations to escaping slaves, people from both the North and the South who knew slavery was wrong, and even some former enslaved Africans who had won their freedom and wanted to help others. Enslaved people won their freedom by escaping to an area where slavery was illegal. Harriet Tubman made it safely to freedom in the North using the Underground Railroad. Enslaved Africans like Harriet were free in northern states like Pennsylvania, where slavery was not allowed. But they weren't entirely safe until they left the United States and entered the land north of the United States. This country to the north of the United States is known today as Canada. This was because the laws allowed slave catchers to enter free states in the north to catch runaway slaves and return them to a life of slavery in the south. So even though they were free in the north, slave catchers could still enter the north and capture them and bring them back to the south. So they had to leave the United States entirely. Harriet did not stay in Pennsylvania for long. She missed her family and friends and could not bear the thought of them remaining in slavery while she enjoyed a new free life. She decided she had important contributions to make to help those who were still enslaved. Remember, contributions could be money, materials, or information given by someone to help others. So Harriet knew that there was something more she could give to these people to help them. So Harriet Tubman became a conductor on the Underground Railroad and returned to the South 19 more times over several years, risking her own life and her freedom each time to help other enslaved Africans escape to freedom. Harriet Tubman soon became one of the bravest and most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. Her name became well known among the supporters of slavery. So a lot of plantation owners and slave catchers knew about her because she helped a lot of slaves escape from them. Plantation owners put rich rewards out for her capture. Within a few years, they wanted her stopped at all costs, but she kept going back again and again, helping more and more enslaved people escape. Harriet was startled by the distant sound of dogs barking, and she knew that danger was near. "Wake up now! Wake up!" she urged, shaking the men and women. "Gather up these babies. We've got to get a move on." The men and women sprang to their feet with fear and panic. "Don't you worry now," she assured them. "I know a station not too far from here, but we'll have to move fast, and we'll have to stay in the creek to keep those dogs off of the trail." They hustled out of the swamp and splashed up the creek, where dogs would have a hard time following their scent. The dogs would sniff along the ground to pick up the scent or smell of a person. This was more difficult for a dog to do in water. An hour later, soaked in sweat and muddy creek water, they arrived in the front yard of a small farmhouse. The runaway slaves hid in the weeds, while Harriet Tubman slipped through the yard and onto the front porch. She tapped 3 times on the door, waited a moment, and then tapped 2 more times. This was a secret knock, so the people in the house would know their visitor was an Underground Railroad conductor in need of help. A white woman opened the door. She signaled for the runaways to follow her into the chicken coop. There, she lifted a trap door in the floor, revealing a dark hole. "It's not comfortable," she told them, "but nobody will find you here. I have some stew and biscuits inside, and fresh milk. I'll bring it out as soon as the coast is clear." Their hearts raced as they waited in their hideout, expecting to hear the slave catchers' dogs barking any minute. But the dogs never came. Running through the creek had thrown the slave catchers off of the trail, and for now, the runaways were safe. They wanted to sleep, but when the sun went down, they had to move on again. There was no time to waste, for nighttime was the only safe time to travel. Outside, Harriet Tubman looked up to the starry sky. She put her arm around one of the children. "See there," she said, pointing upward. "That group of stars up there. It kind of looks like a ladle you might use to scoop water from a bucket. Back where I'm from, we used to call it a drinking gourd." Remember, a gourd is a fruit that has a tough outer shell, and its insides can be scooped out, and then the gourd can be used to scoop up water. "Do you see it?" "I think so," the child said. Now, see the cup of that drinking gourd? Harriet Tubman asked. Look at the two stars at the end of the cup and pretend you can draw a straight line from those two stars straight out into space. If you follow that line straight out, you will find the North Star. It is always there, right in the same spot, and you can always find it if you know how to find the drinking gourd in the sky. Do you know why that star is so important? Why? The child asked. Because the North Star is always to the north. If we follow the North Star every night and keep it in front of us, then it will guide us to the north to freedom. And heading to the north and to freedom is exactly what they did. In the read aloud today, we heard gnats, mosquitoes, and flies swarmed all around, buzzing and biting. Flies, in this sentence, means an insect with two wings. Flies can also mean other things, like when something flies through the air like a bird or an airplane. This is a drinking gourd. You can see that it has been scooped out to create a space, a hollow space, where you can scoop water. Attached to this lesson, there's a link to another YouTube video that has the song, The Drinking Gourd. This was a coded song, which means that it gave enslaved Africans a message about how to use the Underground Railroad to escape to freedom in the North. The plantation owners, however, did not realize the secret meaning of the words in the song. This was another way that enslaved Africans could rebel against the plantation owners. Enslaved Africans often couldn't rebel by fighting directly with the plantation owner because the plantation owner had guns and the enslaved Africans did not. But they could rebel by tricking the owner like this. Pay attention to the lyrics of the song and see if you can figure out how it would help enslaved Africans find their way to freedom.